Good morning, everyone. It is a real pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Patty, Albert, Maria, all the organizers, Rafa. It's, I love gatherings. Like, this is a feast for thinking and getting inspiration from different sides and building stronger pathways towards the world we want to build. I want to share some ideas which I'm completely responsible for, but they derive from a broad collective effort. So I must thank, first of all, the research team involved in this project, and also all the participants and facilitators that were giving a lot of their heart and minds to this process, about which I'll be talking. Well, everyone in this room is very familiar with the transdisciplinary approach, just so that we can go back to some of the principles and the reasons why we talk about transdisciplinary collaboration if we want to build pathways towards sustainability and a good Anthropocene. There are epistemic, ethical, and political reasons for working, collaborating among sectors, different actors in sectors. If we have different perspectives coming together, we have a better possibility of achieving a more complex understanding of the socio-ecological systems. Co-produced knowledge is more socially pertinent and more easily applicable by different sectors at different scales. And transdisciplinary collaboration promotes broader social participation, which can lead to more transformative political outcomes. So we're talking about epistemic reasons, complex understanding with all the challenges that this type of process involves, but also about the implementation of more sustainable practices. In a world that is largely ruled by economic and political powers that are not aligned with the sustainable paradigm, scientific knowledge may be necessary for the construction of a good Anthropocene, but it is far, far, far from sufficient. So the power of knowledge depends necessarily on the knowledge we can acquire about power. They are mutually dependent. Like, if we want to empower our scientific views and make them have a political effect, we do need to know more about how power structures are in the power conjunctures in which knowledge navigates or is constructed. There are many different transdisciplinary approaches, like different schools. I won't get into details about those different trends, but I just want to point out that the work we've been doing here in Mexico is very much influenced by two main currents of transdisciplinarity. A more pragmatic approach, problem-oriented approach, which is part of it's becoming more and more a tradition within sustainability sciences. Most of the literature comes from Europe, even more so than from the United States and other global north countries. But we are very informed by a tradition, a Latin American tradition, which many of you are familiar with, and that's the participatory action research, PAR. So popular education, that's my background, in social sciences. So what we've been doing is to establish some dialogue between those two approaches, and very interesting reflections come from that sort of position. Well, very briefly, I want to share very few results, perhaps the most provocative ones that come out of this beautiful process we had with 38 transdisciplinary teams within Mexico. They work in 20 different states, and we were directly working with 128 members, actors from different sectors. And here we have the distribution of the sectors that were involved in those workshops and dialogue processes. They're mainly from OSCs, or as the English would be. Here in Mexico, we don't, working with these groups, they ask not to be called NGOs. So over there I have NGO, but they are civil society organizations. They ask not to be defined by that which they are not. Yeah? So we talk about civil society organizations. They were a broad group within those processes, academics and community members from rural and urban communities, so people who are participating in sustainability projects in different communities. And something which really called our attention, and to which I'll be coming back in a moment, is the fact that we were not able to have in our transdisciplinary teams a very important representation of government and industry actors. And that's actually something we want to discuss later on. There are all sorts of sustainability projects involved in that process. They're mostly dedicated to agroecological practices, also community-based water management, conservation and ecological restoration. And an important sector is also, a portion of those projects deal with environmental justice and human rights. That's also an important piece of information considering our contexts. So, amongst all the questions we asked, these 38 different transdisciplinary teams, there were those very important questions about the obstacles they encounter. What are the barriers, the main difficulties they encounter in their collaboration process? And I will only share some of the problems. Well, you can imagine there's a very broad constellation of problems there, difficulties, barriers, obstacles. But I want to focus on some of the problems that I think will allow an important discussion about the type of contexts in which these projects are immersed. So, and the barriers I want to share, to identify and comment on, they actually do not appear in much of the literature. So we've been, of course, reading and sharing a lot of information on transdisciplinary collaboration, and some of these aspects are rarely mentioned or not mentioned at all. So as our research team came up with the question, would Mexico and the Global South deal with conditions for transdisciplinary collaboration that differ substantially, or to what degree do they differ from those of the Global North? Well, first of all, there are quite a few challenges related to a pluricultural nation. We are in a country where there are 56 indigenous groups, a great variety of languages, a huge complexity, a wealth of biocultural diversity. So we're talking about 12% of the population here who are very much involved in sustainability projects, not only because they offer very important examples of what that is about, but also because they have to defend the territory and the form of life from many important current threats. So those challenges when they do collaborate, they come together with other members, actors from other sectors. They have to do with language differences that can make communication difficult and coming to agreements. And there's also a lack of recognition of indigenous knowledge and forms of organization, local institutions. Some do report that they feel discriminated. There are conflicts between the state and federal government, the state level, and local autonomous indigenous governments. Yeah, we're also talking about a country where we have different experiences of indigenous autonomous government. There are tensions with the government, which make it difficult and in some cases impossible to collaborate with the government sector. So we're talking about small local-based sustainability projects and how they relate with government. There are many tensions there in many cases, not all of them. So they also mentioned the cooptation of community participation spaces by political authorities at different levels. Another problem that is mentioned and that also represents that difficulty to collaborate with the government sector has to do with how public programs do not have a continuity. They're established, but then they change government and they have to start over again and again. And also local political conflicts that represent a lot of division within communities. Corruption and lack of confidence in officials, legal authorities is also mentioned. In some cases, like in one experience, they were talking about the complicity that government actors have with illegal loggers, lack of transparency in public funding, and bureaucracy, not only in government, but also in academia. And also, very sadly, it is very important to talk about violence and the lack of safety in so many rural and urban places and communities where sustainability projects are being carried out. And like I share a very strong graph. I don't know if you can see it very well, but this is from 2016, the number of fatalities per country. So we don't say that there is a war going on in Mexico right now, but if we look at the fatalities, like how many people have died because of social violence and in all forms, we're only behind Syria in numbers. And it's, of course, very sad and appalling. Like it is. Please do imagine what the effects of that can be if you're working in rural communities. Local-based sustainability projects are part of that very complex socio-political conjuncture. So ideally, if we think of transdisciplinary collaboration, we want all these different sectors to be united, collaborating, coming together to share from their perspectives and build a common goal. Government, academia, civil society organizations, communities, media, industry, and business. That more integral, more complex form of transdisciplinary collaboration would impact on public policy for sustainability, normativity programs, local, regional, national solutions, short and long-term solutions, and of course add to the scientific community with their contributions. But what we see in this context, and I dare to say, like, without having studied many other contexts, but also being from Brazil, I'd say this is not a particular feature of Mexico. Like it's a reality that is shared in many other places around the world. The difficulty to work with government, industry, and media. And the effect of that, if that collaboration is reduced to a certain number of sectors and actors, the impacts are not as broad. They are a lot more localized, short-term solutions. And of course, if academia participates in those processes, we're still learning a lot, but our political impact is a lot more reduced. Just to finish up, I will continue to build on some of the reflections that have already been circulating within this room, and I hope we can, as a very interesting, diverse collective here, build on those ideas and hopefully come up with interesting and important ways of building those pathways towards a good Anthropocene. And I'm so glad that Elena comes after me. So a bit more on the theme of scaling up. On one hand, the absence of government and industry actors in most transdisciplinary teams in the study we did here in Mexico, with a very broad invitation for different groups to participate, that absence, or it wasn't a complete absence, that small number of actors from those sectors may represent a weakness as it limits opportunities to scale up from a certain perspective on what scaling up means. And that's what I want to explore with you. That, on the other hand, it may also reveal alternative forms of social organization and practices that can be more aligned with sustainability than those put forward by government and industry at this current stage, and that have no intentions of scaling up. So, or at least in a conventional sense. What we feel is that it is very difficult to work with government and the industry sector because they are actually the main promoters of what we are against. Like the type, since they have not adopted the sustainability paradigm as we wish they had done, it is hard to collaborate with them. They're at a different mind and practice state. So scaling up for these groups could even represent a risk to their more sustainable forms of life if we think of scaling up in this more conventional sense. So in transdisciplinary barriers, like the barriers and opportunities to go from local to global, what we see in Mexico and perhaps in many other countries is that middle level connection, that so very important part of the process is, actually represents a problem in many contexts, working with government and national governments. So what we have found out is that scaling out is like horizontal networks is what is actually going on in a very important way. But also, we would like to explore alternative ways of scaling up and present them as a point of discussion, because Mexico has a wealth of experiences that could be interpreted as alternative ways of scaling up. And I'm talking about as a more complex, local, not so local, like regional level, autonomous governments, very dedicated to local conservation and control over traditional territories and reinforcing traditional institutions at a smaller scale, but also at a national scale. This is a country, right now, we have a very important socio-political experiment going on. So some of the visitors might not be aware of the process of the National Indigenous Congress, who have actually publicly presented their first Indigenous woman candidate, presidential candidate. And one effect of that very broad national network of experiences is that it does contribute to legitimizing local institutions and very diverse worldviews that do converge, but who is not participating in that process? Well, industry, business, government, yeah, but a very broad range of civil society organizations. And another example of a global, like an international way of scaling up is La Via Campesina. So resistance against conventional forms of power and the creation of alternative pathways that do include indigenous and peasant institutions and knowledge towards a more just and sustainable future. These are taking place in this country and many other countries with similar political conjunctures. Here's some photos of those processes. So, we do have quite a few barriers and obstacles to scale up, especially if we think of scaling up in a more conventional sense of incorporating government as, like, formal government is an ally. So we've talked about the local horizontal networks and alternative ways of scaling up, going past those social political structures. And just to end up, 2 questions, but perhaps there would be more on those topics. How widespread are these alternative pathways or ways of scaling up? And I'd be curious to hear as well from other contexts. And what opportunities may they represent to global sustainability? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Albert. Thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to be here, not only to speak to you, but to have learned so much over the past few days from all the really wonderful talks I've heard and sessions that I've participated in, and Juliana's great talk as well. Okay, so let's start some trouble. Let's start in the Anthropocene, a new geologic epoch in which humankind has emerged as a globally significant and potentially intelligent force, capable of reshaping the face of the planet. In that Anthropocene, scientists are increasingly recognizing that there is no policymaker sitting at his desk, hand on the lever, waiting for the right scientific information to help him make a decision about which of 2 ways he's going to flip that switch. Instead, there's this incredibly complex, messy business that moves in many directions at once, where there's populist movements and short-term decisions that are affecting high-stakes issues. In that world, there's no privileged place for science, and so scientists have to engage with communities directly to form the kind of relationships that can give science a role in the decision-making process. And I want to thank Georgina Kundal-Kemp and the Ecoservices governance team for influencing with me with these ideas and allowing me to basically steal them and present them. And increasingly, PECS researchers and other scientists around the world are engaging. They're doing just that. So how else is science different in the Anthropocene? What other opportunities await us in this time? So in a pre-Anthropocene science, or maybe I should call it an early Anthropocene science, science was all about describing problems. How many species have we lost? What's the precise quantification of human influence on a particular kind of pollution? And so I don't know about you, but I am really tired of cataloging problems with increasingly more precise explanations. And I think that other people are too. And so we see, not only here at PECS, but in other places as well, a groundswell of scientists who are moving beyond describing problems to working directly with communities, to using scientific knowledge, scientific thinking, in conjunction with other ways of knowing to try to build a better world for everyone together. And everywhere I turn, I'm hearing about use research, knowledge to action research, co-design, co-construction, which means something more than just applied science. It means actually getting our hands dirty in this messy world of moving forward with communities around the world. So in this world, with complex, messy decision-making, a world in which I and many other scientists are increasingly trying to play a role in community conversations about the future, there's a question that follows me around, and it's a question that inhabits my thoughts when I'm awake and invades my dreams when I sleep. And the question is this: how can we do science, this community-driven science, in a way that brings hope and empowerment to communities? When we talk about the future of the planet, it really can be quite disheartening and dispiriting. We can feel bombarded by dystopian visions of collapse, degradation that come with this sort of early Anthropocene focus on cataloging the problems. But hope is incredibly important. Yesterday, I heard a really great talk, that's happening, in which Matt Koloff described really eloquently how hope engenders agency and motivation to achieve change, and how that kind of agency in turn engenders more hope by creating a world of possibility. So how do we retain hope? And how, when we're working with communities, do we give them hope, especially now in a time that I think can feel so hopeless? Before I move to hope, I don't want to belittle that hopelessness. So if we look around the world, the unprecedented pace of anthropogenic change raises a lot of concerns about the future of the biosphere. But my fear is that if we just extrapolate current trends, we run the risk of creating a self-fulfilling negative world because people base their actions on what they believe about society and what they expect for the future. So if we only talk about problems, we start to see only problems and live as if the world is only problems. So here's my job today. The future doesn't have to be bleak. In fact, as people become aware of threats to society, we see communities, scientists, activists all around the world engaging in strategies to create for themselves a more just, a more prosperous, and a more ecologically diverse world, what we might call a good Anthropocene. And it turns out that inspirational visions and stories can be a key component of these transformations to a better Anthropocene. They help shape the very world, the very reality that they forecast. In science, we call this kind of storytelling scenario building or scenario planning, the practice of developing several imagined stories, sometimes quantified with models, about the future and how the future might unfold. And these stories have long been used in the military, in the business, and in the scientific communities to explore alternative futures and to increase our capacity to respond to and even to shape the future. But nearly all the existing scientific scenarios, such as those that I was involved with, developed by the Millennium Assessment or scenarios by the IPCC, tend to follow the same set of pathways with the same handful of ideas about how the future is going to unfold. In particular, the positive futures tend to feature poorly articulated pathways to utopian fantasies, or they overestimate the power of mainstream strategies to create real change. So we get scenarios like technology will fix it, or the localization might help scenario, or first we should attend to equity and justice, and then everything else will work itself out. And we see those played out over and over again in global scientific scenarios. And that leaves out a lot of really important issues. Things like cultural diversity, resilience, political economy, colonialism, conflict of the sort that Juliana was talking about, different types of urbanization, different worldviews, and really importantly, it leaves out the role of trust, hope, and fun in the sort of future. And it underestimates the really messy back and forth of community decision-making that I've already talked about. And it leaves us with scenarios that probably look way too much like the status quo world that we're already living in. When in fact we know that the future is likely to be radically different in ways that are almost impossible to predict. That future is going to involve fundamental alterations of human-environment relationships, changes in values, changes in assumptions, in technology, in culture, in worldviews, even changes in the power relations that influence the social norms that are so important to us today. So we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves. It's hard to tell realistic stories about the future. All you have to do is go just down the road to Monte Alban, stand there, picture that you're standing there in the year 100 BC, the height of Zapotec power, and trying to turn to the person next to you and explain this, the world of Oaxaca today. It's almost impossible. How do you explain any of that, let alone what we're doing here at the PECS conference? So, how do we solve this problem? We need positive, even inspirational visions. We need them to be radically novel, but we need them to feature realistic pathways that people can believe in. So I'm proposing that we start with those emerging, innovative ideas and projects that I mentioned earlier, the ways people are already responding to the problems of the Anthropocene. And in this project that I'll talk about today, we call these things bright spots, or seeds of good Anthropocenes. And so I'll give you an example just so I can ground what this means a little bit. So the example I'll talk about is called Health in Harmony. They're a group that works in Indonesian Borneo, and they work to address human health and deforestation. And here's what they do. They offer free or low-cost health care to individuals or communities in exchange for commitments to stop deforestation. So how well is it working? Over the past 5 years since they've started working, they've seen a 68% decrease in illegal logging and an increase in every single indicator of human health that they can measure. Pretty great success. So how do they do this? They basically are reconnecting a feedback between forest health and community health that probably existed long ago, but that went missing in a world of globalization, when people's families would get sick, and they felt that their only alternative, their only way to make money, was to cut down trees and sell them in order to be able to pay for the health care that they needed. And specifically, what this group does, led by their leader, Kinari Webb, is engage in what they call radical listening, which is really about engaging with the community, much in the way that we're talking about engaging with the community here at PECS. It looks something a lot like knowledge to action science, but from the NGO perspective. So in this Bright Spots project, the Seeds of a Good Anthropocene, we're using an international participatory process, and our team has collected over 500 examples just like this from all around the world, and we've established a database of information about them. And we're doing a lot with that database. We're trying to understand why these bright spots emerge, understand the characteristics of the ones that thrive or that spread or grow or inspire other kinds of change in their very own locations. We're trying to understand what they might tell us about, for example, achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So I don't want to talk too much about that. I want to stick today to scenarios and storytelling, but just to mention that there is a database and that we can do quite a lot with it in terms of understanding how these small changes can scale up and lead to other changes. Let me talk a little bit, though, about how we develop scenarios from these seeds. So we start with a handful of them, and those are shown here in yellow in the center of these little pods. And we imagine, what would the world look like if this seed was now the norm, if this was the mature condition of the world? We imagine the first order consequences, which you see in blue, and the second order consequences, which you see in red. And we do this, as you can see here, for 3 or so seeds at once, so we get interactions, because not all good Anthropocenes are going to look the same, and in fact, some seeds synergize with one another, some don't interact at all, and some actively compete or fight against each other because their vision of what makes the world good in the future is actively different. Because these seeds are diverse and complex, the kinds of stories that we end up telling are diverse and complex as well. And because the seeds exist already, we end up getting scenarios that have realistic pathways because it's something that's already happening. So what we do next is we work forward and backwards in this 3 horizons framework to try to build from those visions and seeds to tell the actual stories. And let me tell you a little bit about the 3 horizons. So the first horizon is the way that things are done now. This is features of the world that are a good fit with today, but over time, as we move into the future, some of those things, some of those features aren't going to fit as well in the future. So those are things that you might imagine that we need to have go away in order to achieve the positive future that we want. Then we think about the third horizon. This is really where our seeds come in. This is the emerging patterns that are going to be the successor to the current first horizon. It's things on the fringes today that might be the mainstream tomorrow. And although a dominant pattern is eventually going to emerge, we don't know what it is. So we have different worldviews that are presented and contested in that third horizon. And then we have the second horizon, the most interesting place. This is a turbulent domain of transition. It's where innovations that people try, some are helping to extend Horizon 1, some are facilitating the emergence of Horizon 3. And what we do is work back and forth in these horizons, forwards and backwards through time, to help develop scenarios that start with the seeds, that are radically novel, that go somewhere positive, and have realistic pathways. So we recently completed an exercise to try this out in Northern Europe. We did this past summer. We had a team involved in doing this that involved scientists, activists, artists, writers, seed entrepreneurs, and we told stories. We started with a number of seeds, Northern European seeds in this case, so it featured things like rewilding the Scottish Highlands, the Health and Harmony Project that I talked about already, projects that are aiming to change finance or radical finance, new technology like self-driving cars, anti-austerity movements in Spain, indigenous cooperatives, seeds that had to do with food, eating, and farming. Just go back one. And we worked along this process to develop scenarios. And the scenarios that we came up with featured rewilding, radical listening, but also changes in the way that people spend their time, changes in the way civic governance happens, decentralizations of power, and changes in knowledge sharing. And interestingly, the process helped us to identify the key levers of change, the things that happen in that second horizon that allow us to get to a radical future. And those turned out, in this case, to be things like values, communication and connection to other people, how we spend our time, how much free time we have, trust, connection to nature, and diversity of all sorts. And those key levers were interesting to me because they're the kinds of things that we often don't even discuss when we're developing traditional scientific scenarios. Okay. So, everyone has shown this graph in the plenary, so I just thought I ought to just show it too. Okay. Just kidding. I actually want to say something about it. So this is an excellent figure from Maria Tanga's work. I know it didn't feel right to leave plenary without seeing it again, but more importantly, I think it's really important, and it gives me a way to come back to where I started, to community-based science, and how do we create what Maria calls functioning mechanisms for legitimate, transparent, constructive synergies across knowledge systems. Because to me, the kind of community-driven scenario-building exercises with stakeholders that we're engaging with, they're a really elegant solution to this problem of needing to incorporate multiple viewpoints, and even incorporating conflicting ideas of what makes the good in good Anthropocene. And it does that while developing hopeful, positive stories about how the future might look, and encourages in-depth thinking about pathways. So as a community of researchers here at PECS, all of us working in place-based science, we have tremendous potential for impact. And I think we can maximize that potential by creating conversations about positive change and by helping the communities that we work with see possibilities, see hope, and see agencies in describing the world that we want. I want to thank many of my fellow travelers in this, including the scientists, activists, seed entrepreneurs who have participated in workshops, built the database, analyzed the database, and really helped shape a lot of my thinking and a lot of the ideas that I've presented here today. So, thanks.
Wow, two great, fantastic talks. I'm going to ask us to look into our crystal balls a bit, okay? So, co-produced knowledge, transdisciplinary research has been thought of, sometimes even advocated by many big global research networks as the solution to the challenges of the Anthropocene. So if we're looking in our crystal balls, I want you to think 25 years ahead in the future that we've managed to solve many of those problems in the Anthropocene, and co-produced transdisciplinary research has been part of that. How would that space look like? What barriers have been overcome, and what new kind of structures have been put in place? So I'll start with you, Juliana.
Thank you, Albert. Well, I want to think that in 25 years' time, academia will be a lot more engaged than it is now. Like that people are sensitive to the socio-political, of course, people in this room, we are very, very sensitive about environmental issues. But making that very crucial link between environmental issues and political issues is if we don't see that connection and if we don't work towards changing the power structures that make it possible for the unsustainable world that we live in to be here, we just can't be effective in what we're doing. So, and how do we do that? There are a number of ways, and transdisciplinary work has to do with addressing those power issues very centrally. So I want to think that academia will be a lot more engaged and sensitive to all those dimensions, and not only sensitive to that, but also contributing to finding effective solutions with our partners. And that is directly related to other forms of social organization and decentralizing power. I think it's part of the type of scenario we want to see. So polycentric governance is a way forward. Like it's what we want to see being implemented in various places, connecting experiences that are very inspiring, and I really appreciate all the work that is being done around the seeds of the good Anthropocene, because we need concrete examples of what we can do in order to feel inspired and also find the practical ways, the operational ways of making them a reality. I talk about those two main dimensions: academia being engaged with those processes, and the experimentation of other socio-political forms of organization. And to me, that has a lot to do with decentralizing power.
Okay, so I'll just add to that by pointing out maybe two things. That if academia is going to engage, there are two things that I think we'd have to address, at least two, but two that are on my mind. And one is the issue of power and how science engages and what role we play. And then the other is scaling. So, it feels great to me to come to PECS and be in this world where everybody else is doing place-based research, but not everybody is and not everybody should. And so I think we need to find a way to link with our fellow scientists who are working at national scales and at global scales so that we can address some of the links that Juliana pointed out are important too.
Okay, thanks. Berta, do we have any questions from the audience? A lot. Hope they're in English.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I can ask Juliana to...
No, I translate.
Well, thank you. Okay, so we have one question here. Where we've been asked for the two panelists to give some reflections about socio-affective and socio-emotional challenges for transdisciplinarity. And I see you nodding, Juliana, so I'll give Juliana the first time.
Well, Elena also talked about trust. It's a base. Like, so I very little. Like, there's so many emotions that are crucial. Like they're not a secondary, like an epiphenomenon or something that is not so important. When we're talking about transdisciplinary collaboration, there are some central affects or affections that can have to be cultivated. Some are a lot more spontaneous, and they are what allow people to come together. So empathy is, I'd say, a very important component of building bonds that can be very effective in reasoning, but also in action, like in thinking and being inspired and making more effective proposals. And trust, and well, part of what I presented has to do with how many of the difficulties of working with some sectors have to do with the fact that people don't trust some of these actors. So how can we build trust? Well, first of all, actions like what we see, the practices we see are what inspire trust and allow us to collaborate and build a way forward.
Elena, do you want to add to that? Yeah.
I'll just speak a little bit briefly, not about the work that I talked about here, but other work that I'm doing in a community around Montreal, just to say that I think a lot of this kind of work, we've been working there for over 10 years. This is not easy. It takes a long time to build the sort of trust that is needed to really engage in the messiness that happens in these decisions. And it's not a superficial question to ask about trust and relationship building and the importance of that.
Something we learned from the groups with which we worked here in Mexico is that there is very little trust towards academia as well. I don't know what you experience in your contexts, but many community members, actors, they just don't trust academia because academia is not offering any important pathway or solution, or they're not working as partners. But there are so many groups who will just not accept researchers to come along and do their research and then leave and not offer anything in return. So from our academic sector, it is also a huge issue if you want to work with people and do more local-based research.
So I guess this next question was something that was buzzing around in my mind as well, especially during your talk, Juliana. The existence of massive social violence, right, in many places in the world, whereas community sustainability initiatives are happening. And considering that impact, it's often seen, it's a bit like the elephant in the room, right, that no one really addresses. So do you have any propositions on how we can include it in a more applied and conceptual way in our work?
In a more conceptual way. Well, I think it is very important. It is necessary to do so. Right now I can't think of any, it has to be addressed. Practically, you either do it or you just don't work with people. There's no alternative. You have to find ways of dealing with that and protecting ourselves and community actors. And well, in Brazil, like I come from Brazil, and we're the top country in number of environmentalists who are assassinated, like environmental leaders in the world. It's just, so how do we do place-based environmental research and working with partners who are being threatened for the justice issues they're tackling? And it is a matter of, in so many cases of course, so in life integrity, we do need to address it conceptually, and it depends on what we're doing and what sort of work we're doing there. But I agree. I don't know how exactly. I only know that practically, in an operational sense, yeah, it is, of course, a must.
Berta, do we have time for
Yeah, we have time for
one more question, maybe?
one or two, it depends on the answer.
1.5 then.
One in Spanish, one is translated from the
Okay. Okay, so this question deals with the context presented by Juliana and Elena are radically different. So what could come out of combining the two broad approaches taken? And I'll let you, Elena, take a first stab at that.
Yeah, they are quite different, and yet there's quite a lot of connection or similarity that I heard. So, for example, with the seeds of Ugarit Anthropocene, many of those are local projects, but we're using them in a way to try to imagine how they might scale up and affect larger processes. So if we're dealing with a situation in which governments are non-existent players, then that can be an important part of thinking about how those things scale up. And even I think some of these questions of violence or power, we can address those in stories and in storytelling in some ways where it's easier a little bit for people to step outside of the immediate next decision that has to be made and into a world of imagination that sometimes just frees up a little bit those constraints that we face. So I think there is actually a connection.
I think they're extremely complementary. Like, I focused on the barriers, of course, and what I mentioned about the alternatives was just too vague. But if we focus in more detail on the alternatives already in place in Mexico as well, we are talking about very, very promising, fantastic experiences that are not isolated. Huh? They are working at huge networks. We're talking about indigenous agroecological co-ops, union of cooperatives. We're talking about autonomous governments that have the environmental issue very well placed in their agenda. We're talking about a national campaign that has to do with exerting power from a very, very different logic. The indigenous candidate we have now running for presidency, what is she saying? I don't want this position of I'm using the system to convey the idea that what we really need to do is to organize, get very well organized in our communities. So there are many more subtle paradoxes that have to do with these other logics of power and social organization that are extremely promising, but they can only reach mainstream society if we have those dispositions, and many of them are the type of emotional attitudes, and to listen to these very different voices and to allow ourselves to transform communities, the communities of which we are part, including the academic community.
Thank you. I'd just like to thank Elena and Juliana for providing insights.